everybody's passing out except for one person, 25-year-old flight attendant Andreas Prodromou, who, when the masks came down, he was awake, he was conscious, and instead of grabbing one of those masks from the overhead, he managed to connect himself to one of the emergency oxygen tanks. Now, the reason that's very important is the masks that drop down on an aircraft have a very limited supply of oxygen. But Andreas, who was actually training to be a pilot, was aware of that, and he put on this emergency oxygen tank, which had way more oxygen to it. And so suddenly he's breathing a much longer air source, and he's looking around the plane, and everybody's passed out except for him. Now, we don't know at what point he learned this, but at some point, Andreas would have noticed, as he's breathing on this emergency oxygen tank, that out the window he would see the plane is just flying in circles. And it would have dawned on him that not only are the passengers out, but very likely so are the pilots. And so literally there's nobody flying this plane. And so he had a decision to make. Either he was going to just sit here until the plane crashed, or he was going to do something, like try to fly the plane. And that's what he ultimately decided to do. And so Andreas stood up, he took his oxygen tank, and he headed into the cockpit, and after moving aside the unconscious pilots, he attempted to fly this plane. And so the two fighter pilots who flew up alongside the cockpit and looked in and saw that one random guy who was waving to them, that was Andreas. And unfortunately, despite the fact that Andreas was training to become a pilot, he was not remotely qualified or skilled enough to fly a big Boeing 737. He had no idea how to fly this aircraft. And making the situation even worse is very shortly after Andreas entered the cockpit, the plane ran out of fuel. And so it left its automatic holding pattern that it had been in, flying in circles, and just automatically began trying to descend. But that required pilot input to land the plane. But Andreas knew he couldn't possibly land this plane successfully. And so as the plane automatically began its descent down towards Athens, this huge city full of people, Andreas did the one thing he could do. He took one last look at one of the fighter pilots outside the window, and he gestured to them that the plane was now beginning to descend. And then Andreas, he grabbed the yoke of the aircraft, and he intentionally banked it to the left, basically flying the plane away from Athens, and he guided this plane into an unpopulated hillside where it crashed. Andreas and all 120 people on that plane all died in the crash.